Maybe you knew a person like this, or maybe you are a person like this, but I knew a guy in college who wore the same baseball cap every single day. And he had worn this thing for years, and this cap was absolutely filthy, and it was ragged and ratty. It was frayed around the brim. It had a hole through the middle of it, and it smelled terrible. Like you could smell him from his hat. It was disgusting, but he kept wearing it every day. It was like his security blanket, tying him to his high school years. And he'd gone to he'd gone to the University of Tennessee. He'd entered into a frat, and that hat had been a part of all of his experiences in that frat. And then he'd left there. And anyway, in essence, he was the hat, and the hat was him. Like he couldn't part from it. And I know that we all can have emotional attachments to something. I mean, if you've ever moved, whether it's across town or to another state or around the world, if you've ever moved, you know that there are decisions that have to be made about what you're going to keep and what you aren't going to keep. And that can have some emotional consequences to it. You can feel a tug. Can we bring that with us? No, there's not any more room. We can't bring everything. And you're thinking to yourself, oh, well, I really want that. There's attachments to things. We often hang on to things because of that emotional attachment to them. We don't want to throw something out because maybe it reminds us of good times, or maybe it reminds us of a loved one. But sometimes those things are kind of smelly and worn out, and we still want to keep it around. And our wife is saying, you need to get rid of that. And somehow our emotions also get coupled with those things or with an event. And I'm not sure exactly the biology of it, but it does happen that your emotions get tied. And you know this, you smell a certain smell and it takes you back to a place, or you hear a song on the radio and it takes you back to a moment, right? There's an emotion tied to that thing, the song or the smell, and it's tied to that, and there's a memory associated with it, and you feel good or you feel angry or whatever. Now, I want to tell you there's nothing wrong with that, right? There's nothing wrong with having an emotional attachment to something or something even evoking an emotion within you. Those emotions are a gift from God, and we are given those emotions as part of our unique reflection of who God is, because God is emotional. However, just like everything else, when you live in a sinful world, emotions can go haywire. They can become controlling ultimate things. One of the most biblical propositions on the subject of emotions was actually a review that I saw about 10 years ago for the movie Inside Out. Now, if you know the movie, you know the movie's all about emotions. And something that Jeremy Pierre wrote for the Gospel Coalition back in 2015, he says about emotions, God designed our hearts to desire what he desires. We were made to find joy in what he finds joy in, be disgusted by what he's disgusted by, be saddened by what grieves him, be angered by what angers him, and fear the things he identifies as threatening. In other words, our desires and the emotions expressed by them worship God as they imitate his. The main hindrance is that our hearts are inclined to find joy in what he hates, to be disgusted by what he says is good, to be fearful of what he says brings life. Our emotions are corrupted by our fallen condition. And we need the redemption of Jesus Christ, the only one who managed his emotions perfectly to the glory of God by valuing what God valued. Exactly. Spot on. Even though our emotions are a gift from God, it's really vital for us to remember that our emotions, while they can be decent passengers in our life, they are terrible drivers of our lives. Imagine this. Just go with me on this journey. You're going on a family vacation. We've all been on family vacations. And as a road trip vacation, your tendency, especially as a father, I know this, dads, is to ignore whatever's going on in the back seat. And you do so because the back seat is full of things like, are we there yet? Timmy's poking me. I'm not, R2. I'm hungry. Are we there yet? I have to go potty. When are we stopping? If you've been on a road trip, you know, you've heard those things. And so it's understandable that you might want to tune out the back seat. If there was a volume knob, you would definitely turn it off if you could. But you don't want to do that if what the back seat is saying is, I don't feel so good. I think I'm going to throw up. If you completely ignore the back seat, you do so to your own detriment. There's a measure of power that you have to give to the back seat on that kind of a trip. But that doesn't mean that you let them drive, right? So how does that apply to our emotions? Well, in our society today, and maybe you've experienced this as well, but as I observe our society, what seems to be being communicated by our society is, let your emotions go wherever they lead you. Allow your most immature, undeveloped, puerile responses just guide your life. And don't you dare suppress your emotions. That's the worst thing that you can do. Let them flow unfettered and unrestrained and unaddressed. In other words, let the kids drive. So the challenge for followers of Jesus within that sort of cultural carnival of an emotional free-for-all is, how do we align our own head and our own heart and lives with God's head and heart? And that's really what this series is all about. And so let's ask some questions in order to be able to analyze this. First, the first question that I want to ask is, are we holding on to something that should be thrown out? Are there things in our lives that are old and that have gotten worn out and damaged, but we're emotionally attached to them and we don't want to throw them out? See, God is nudging us and he's saying, hey, that thing, that part of your life is kind of old and gross and you should get rid of it. And you know what? I'm here to help as the mover. Let me help you clear that out. But we're like, oh, I don't know, I kind of like this thing. There's a lot of memories that are attached to it. And it makes me feel centered and balanced and attached to my past. Kind of like Linus and his blanket, right? Are there some things like that in your life? That's a question that we all have to honestly ask ourselves. So this is what Paul is speaking to in our passage today in Colossians chapter 3. He says, put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you: sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. On account of these, the wrath of God is coming. In these you too once walked when you were living in them. And Paul says, this stuff that you have an attachment to is not indicative of who you are now. You're somebody new. And so if you keep this around, it's going to continue to exercise an emotional pull on you. Throw it all away. Put it all away. Put it to death is what he says. And what this shows us, I think, is that there are some people, maybe a group of them, we don't know how many, but there were at least some of the Colossian church who were not moving boldly into the new life that Christ had purchased for them. They were living partly as new Christians, and partly they were living in whatever they were before they came to Christ. They were holding on to things. There was a spiritual immaturity causing a sort of ping pong effect back and forth between who they are now and their attachment to what they were. Paul says that sort of tension shouldn't exist. And jumping up the passage, go back to verse 1 of chapter 3 for context. He says, if then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. Now, in that passage, note the verb tenses. It says, for you have died, and you have been raised. It's all past tense. That's all the stuff that has happened in the past. That's the miracle that God has worked in us if we have accepted this free gift of grace that he has given us. If that's true, says Paul, then you should be putting yourself and your focus on things that are above, not things on the earth. If you have died to this life, then the desire to get the things that you once were emotionally attached to should have changed as well. As he said in verse 5, you need to put to death whatever is earthly in you. And so what Paul is saying is, nothing and no one should sit in the driver's seat of your life except Jesus Christ. He's the only one that's worthy of it. He's the only one capable of it, really. And that includes all of your emotions as well. Your life is now with Christ. Christ is supposed to be preeminent in your life. That's what we talked about last week on Good Friday. Chapter 1 of Colossians, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. All things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. So he should be first. He should be highest. He should be chief. If we are his, then he should be in the driver's seat. And so if Jesus says something is good, guess what? It's good. Even if it's hard. And if he says something is wrong, it's wrong. Even if it feels good. He says if something is evil, it's evil. If he says something is true, it's true. His opinion, Jesus' opinion about all things, trumps every other opinion, including mine. So if he says he's the way, guess what? He's the way. If I come across something, anything in the Bible that conflicts with what I think, guess who's wrong? Me. Now that is clearly, obviously, countercultural. And I get that, right? In this day and age, we are taught to elevate ourselves into the driver's seat of our lives. There is a cult of self in our culture today. And so this is very confrontational to that. And listen, I'm not trying to pick a fight with that. I'm just trying to follow where the path leads in terms of what Scripture teaches us. And Paul said, put to death what is earthly. The earthly way is all about self-promotion, seeing ourselves rise and triumph. Seeing ourselves at the center of our own story. The earthly way ultimately is sin, though. The 17th century preacher John Owen said, be killing sin or it will be killing you. In other words, take an aggressive approach to sin because sin is really the biggest problem. It will kill you. And as I was thinking about that phrase, I was reminded of Aaron Ralston this week. Do you remember Aaron Ralston? He was made immortalized, I guess you would call it, in the movie 127 Hours. Now your memory is starting to be jogged if you weren't jogged by the name, because Aaron Ralston was bouldering, climbing around on a bunch of rocks in a slot canyon out in Utah, and a boulder slipped, and it crushed his arm in between the boulder and the cliff face that he was up against. And after being trapped there for days, he was faced with a simple choice: lose your arm or lose your life. Because something was happening in terms of the biology of his body. His arm was becoming necrotic. Now, if you don't know what that means, necrotic is affected with, characterized by, or producing death. So it was either him or his arm, because his arm was producing death. The longer that he was attached to his arm, the more likely it was that he was going to die. And so he severed that attachment to his arm. I would imagine he was pretty emotionally attached to it. And Paul is saying we have to sever our attachment to dead things, because dead things produce more death. That's what they do. And so your choice is simple: get rid of what could kill you or die.